The other day, somebody commenting here remarked that when he was a child, there were no obese children about. Well, this, of course, ties in with talk of the obesity crisis, which one hears mentioned regularly. One of the strange things about this obesity crisis among children is that unless we were continually being reminded of it by newspapers and television, most people wouldn't even be aware that such a thing was supposed to exist. Looking at the average class of primary school children, it doesn't immediately strike one that they are, on the whole, overweight, let alone morbidly obese. Of course, there are one or two fat children in most classes, but surely that was always the case. The fictional Billy Bunter was based on the fact that there were fat children about even a century ago. Despite what is drummed into us relentlessly by the mass media, there's no sign in real life that there are more fat children now than there were a few years ago. The first thing to realise is that claims that there are more overweight children in Britain than there used to be are nothing new. This idea was certainly about when the baby boomers were growing up. In October 1960, the radio programme Any Questions was broadcast from St Mary's Hall, Arundel. Then, as now, the questions from the audience reflected current anxieties. One of the questions that evening was about how to tackle the growing problem of childhood obesity, or, as it was put in those days, what to do about overweight children. This was a very topical subject then. Since the end of rationing in the 1950s, sweets came off the ration in 1953, it had been noticed that there were an increasing number of children who appeared to be overweight. Many people believed that the strict rationing during and after the Second World War had been healthy for children, and that the large amounts of sugar in the form of sweets which were now being consumed was creating what we today call an obesity time bomb. In 1964, the increase in the number of fat children was causing concern for British doctors. On the 13th of November that year, Dr. Otto Wolff, a specialist in child health, told a seminar in Birmingham that overweight children tended to grow into overweight adults and that there was a link between obesity and social class, an idea which regularly appears in the media today. Dr. Wolff, who was reader in paediatrics and child health at Birmingham University, said that obesity was the most common nutritional disturbance in the developed world. Interestingly, he raised precisely the same fears about the risk to long-term health among overweight children that we are hearing now, telling the seminar that about four-fifths of obese children would go on to become obese adults and that this had serious implications for an increased mortality rate. The doctor went on to talk of the need for children to engage in more physical activity. The themes touched upon at the seminar in Birmingham over half a century ago are all very familiar to us. The need for children to get more exercise and the danger of their life expectancy being shortened unless something was done about the problem. Curious indeed to see that such things were already being said when the baby boomers were children. Worries about weight were still going strong a few years later. If anything, they had intensified. A survey in 1967, that is to say almost 60 years ago, found that when asked if they felt that they weighed more in the last 3 months than they would like to, 62% of adults replied that they had. In other words, almost two-thirds of those questions were worried about their weight. Of those who weighed more than they liked, a third said that they first considered themselves overweight as children. In that same year, a clinic for overweight children opened in the northern town of Salford. The aim was to help children lose weight by dieting and regular exercise. The medical officer for health of Salford, Dr. J. Burns, said that the problem of overweight in the 11 to 15 age group is increasing. Bear in mind, I'm talking here of 1967. We can see by all of this that concerns about overweight children are hardly a new phenomenon. For at least 60 or 70 years, ordinary people have been fretting about losing weight and worrying that their children weigh too much. Even at the height of the baby boomer era, it was being claimed that children were growing increasingly and unhealthily fat. The main dietary problem in this country historically has been not overweight, but malnutrition. During the first half of the 20th century, the need was to build children up by providing them with nutritious and enriched food so they wouldn't suffer from deficiency diseases such as rickets and scurvy. Children tended to be skinny and undersized, and this led to all sorts of health problems. With the burgeoning prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s, they began to put on weight, which should really have been a cause for rejoicing rather than anxiety. As the baby boomers grew up, it became for the first time in British history rare to see a seriously underweight and malnourished child. The increasing weight of the baby boomer children went hand in hand with better health and rising life expectancy. That the average child now weighed more than in the 1920s was recognised to be a good thing. They would, as a result, live longer than their parents and grandparents. It's interesting to note that, it's current customary when discussing obesity to mention that in some year in the past, people weighed less than they do today. So we're told that the average man in the late 1950s weighed 10.2 stone, as opposed to today's average of 13.2 stone. The inescapable conclusion being that we're a nation of porkers. Of course, if we go back another 50 years or so, we find that the average weight of recruits to the British Army was less than 9 stone. Perhaps this, rather than the 1950s average weight, should be used as a standard when thinking about obesity. What is it that leads us to believe that 10.2 stones and not 8.7 stones should be the ideal weight on which we should found all our hopes and expectations for the future of the nation's children? Why should anything over this be regarded as dangerous? There's a reason for this. The obesity crisis is essentially a statistical trick. On the 29th of April 2016, Mrs. Claire Margerson of Hull in East Yorkshire received a disturbing letter from Humber NHS Foundation Trust. As part of the sinister sounding National Child Measurement Programme, a 10-year-old son Bradley's height and weight had been measured and recorded. The conclusion was stark. The little boy was overweight. The odd thing about all this was that Bradley Margerson certainly didn't look in the least overweight in photographs, and nor did his weight seem out of the ordinary. The 4 foot 8 inch high boy weighed just 6 stone 8 pounds. Who in their senses could possibly think that this indicated a fat or even a chubby child? Fortunately, both mother and child laughed at the absurdity of the thing, and so no harm was done. Here is a child who would fit into any photograph of healthy boyhood in the 1950s and yet had been officially classified as being overweight. The explanation for this and similar claims that children are overweight or even obese is simple. A child is defined as being overweight if he weighs more than most other children of the same age and sex. This is so obviously a strange way to go about the business, as a brief thought experiment will show. Let us suppose that we are able to travel back in time with all our charts and calculators to the medieval period, and we measure a large number of children's height and weight. Having calculated the average BMI for the group, we would then, using the current methodology, be obliged to say that any child in the 91st centile, that is, a child whose BMI was greater than 90% of the other children, had to be clinically overweight. Never mind that this child, if taken from a hungry or emaciated population, might look skinny as a rake by modern standards. By using these methods, he would be classified as overweight. What we have is a system which will automatically define the proportion of the children in any population, even those starving to death during a famine, as being clinically overweight or obese. A comparison of old school photographs of classes of children from the 1950s are very similar to more modern pictures. Both show groups of average looking children, one or two of whom look a little larger than their classmates. There's really no reason at all to think that more British children are morbidly obese, or even just a little tubby than was the case a few years ago. Another point to bear in mind is that all the available evidence suggests that being a little overweight by today's standards, that is to say, having a BMI between 25 and 30, is actually associated with lower mortality rates than people who are of normal weight. In other words, even if the nation's children were found to be officially overweight, then their life expectancy would be likely to go up rather than down.